relocation camps, the Montagnards were supposed to be housed and fed and protected.
What happened is that the resettlements were badly organized. The Vietnamese are the ones who were supposed to implement them. And the money was stolen. The houses didn't get built. They moved the people on soil where the Montagnards didn't know how to farm. They, by and large, were disastrous. I can't think of any of them that were successful. So the poor Montagnards would get fed up, and they'd pack up and move back to where they came from, in which case they were in the free fire zone. And so they were subject to bombing and shelling and what have you there. And these things happen all the time.
Before the war, every family has a small house with a stock of rice. And during the war, and then you have to go to a strategic hamlet, that stock of rice is destroyed. And then that is where the Montagnard begin to be hungry.
The missionaries tried to bring comfort to the Montagnard refugees. Gordon Smith's son, Stanley, opened a small church with his wife, Jenny, and started a school for refugee children. It was dangerous work. Several of the Vietnamese pastors with whom Stanley Smith worked were killed by the Viet Cong. Of course, by now, thousands of people were dying in the war. Gordon and Laura Smith turned their attention to the orphans who were left behind. They helped organize a network of orphan homes in the highlands, and at a spectacular site on China Beach near Da Nang, they built their largest orphanage. The men grew up in the Smith's orphanage on China Beach.
Khi tôi được mời rồi, thì được các giáo sĩ và các truyền đạo.
When I was 10 years old, I entered the orphanage near Da Nang, and it was a result of the kindness of the missionaries. I was a young boy, working almost like a slave. I had a mother, but my father was a French soldier who was no longer with us. I was an orphan and was taken care of very kindly at the China Beach orphanage. My memories at the orphanage were very fine, especially because I sensed love, especially from Mrs. Laura Smith. And to put it shortly, it was just that we were treated well. It was a very good experience.
The missionaries faced war bravely, but in 1968, when the Tet Offensive swept across the country, war simply overwhelmed them. The mission compound Gordon Smith had built at Ban Mae Thuot was attacked by the Viet Cong.
They threw a grenade in the bunker where I was with 3 other missionaries. And they were killed outright. They were close to the entrance. I was in a corner. So I had quite a few, what do you call them, shrapnel wounds. I thought I was dying. So I was forced to come out with a little tribes boy who had been injured too. And went across the road. And that's when I saw my husband. I saw him slumped over a clothesline. He was shot point blank. Cap. So I'm sure there was an instant of fear, but he had no pain.
Bob Seymour and 6 other missionaries were killed in the attack. Marie Seymour recovered from her wounds. She left Vietnam and never returned. The Smiths' leprosarium on a remote beach with no roads to it was preserved from the horrors of the war for a few more years. But on October 6, 1972, it was devastated by a sudden attack. Laura Smith wrote,
"It was a pitiful sight. Gordon and I wept over the cruel attack. On the grass, the wounded were lying on a few stretchers or bloody mattresses with blankets covering them. Most of them were poor patients already badly mutilated with their leprosy. But now, all of this suffering and misery was added.
One woman was killed, several patients wounded, almost every building destroyed. The patients had no other place to go. They could only rebuild and stay there. The U.S. Armed Forces sent donations. Marine General Lewis Walt helped raise money to ferry wounded orphans to the United States for surgery. And then one day, Laura Smith was able to write,
It's January 28th, 1973. All of a sudden the guns are silent. It's eerie and uncertain. The nightly booming of artillery has ceased. The roaring of jets has dwindled to almost nothing. And the small arms fire around Da Nang has given way to an uneasy peace. The ceasefire is here. By now the U.S. Armed Forces have all gone from Vietnam. We saw the Japanese and French leave years ago. We surely miss the many American officers and men who, through the past 10 years, have been good friends to our work and staunch supporters. Now their great sprawling camps and bases are filled with tens of thousands of refugees, and the huge Da Nang Air Base seems almost deserted.
Gordon Smith had devoted 45 years of his life to the Highland people of Vietnam. He felt they needed him now more than ever. But he was 72. He had a failing heart. In 1974, Gordon and Laura Smith abandoned their mission home and returned to the United States. Their son Stanley remained to carry on, but the ceasefire soon unraveled. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops began their final assault. The battle turned to a rout, and Stanley Smith, his wife and 4 children, barely managed to escape from Da Nang.
What really happened was almost chaos, and Vietnamese by the hundreds, even thousands, were coming over the fence into the airport, and then there was kind of a stampede. We actually had to run to the truck. We made our way to this World Airways plane that had been chartered by the embassy to evacuate us. The engines were running, and it was a 727 Boeing. We were told to quickly get up on that plane, and as we went up the steps, the last person was up, even before the last person was up, the pilot started taxiing out to the runway because he could see many other people coming and trying to get on the same flight.
Refugees poured out of Vietnam. Gordon and Laura Smith offered sponsorship in the United States to as many as they could. Gordon Smith sought to send relief supplies to Vietnam. He sought to return himself.
Even despite the fact that he knew that he had cancer, up until the time he died in 77, he was still trying to negotiate to get back to Vietnam to be with his people. It was something that struck me as to show the great dedication that he had, both for mission work but also for the great love he had for the people of Vietnam, both the Highland people and the Vietnamese.
Laura Smith lived on for 2 more years. She raised support for missionary activities until the day she died in 1979, 50 years from the time of her arrival in Poitiers as a young wife and devoted missionary. And what became of it all? The orphanage and the leprosarium and the dreams of Gordon and Laura.
We've chosen this as the snare for Joshua City. Would you please remain seated until the ship comes to completion?
After 15 years of trying, Stanley and Jenny Smith returned to Vietnam in 1990.
Jim and I were real happy to be able to go back to see how we might be able to be re-involved. We also wanted to portray to our Vietnamese co-workers and friends that we had not forgotten them.
And they were not forgotten. From all over the country, old colleagues and friends joined them for an emotional reunion.
Even though we're physically far apart, we're together in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for taking care of us through difficult times.
Life had been hard. There were stories to tell of death and imprisonment. Nguyen Van Men, who grew up in the China Beach orphanage, has become an evangelist himself.
Tôi đã bị tù vì người ta thi vào con tum.
I was imprisoned in 1975. When the revolution became successful, they felt that anyone like me could not be a part of a new society. The government felt that I had been involved with the Full Row movement, which is a movement among some mountain people. But this was untrue. I had never been an agent for the American government. I have never been involved with this movement for separation from the central government. But I was falsely accused, and I had to go to jail for 12 years.
The churches founded by Gordon Smith are closely watched by the Hanoi government, but they are open and self-sufficient, and their congregations are growing. The pastors think they have reason to hope for an end to the jailing and harassment they have suffered.
indigenous church is what we want. That's what our mission has always stood for. And I have real hopes for the church to continue to grow, both here and in Vietnam too, in spite of the problems. Under persecution, a lot of times the church is stronger, you know that.
And the leprosarium near Da Nang, into which Gordon Smith poured so much of his life and energy, it is still there. Stanley Smith was not allowed to visit it, but he was able to see it from a distance.
It looked like the buildings, for the most part, were intact. But even more importantly, we had heard that even though it was under the jurisdiction of the communist government, that they were doing a fair job with the leprosy ministry. And the leprosy patients themselves knew that we were in Da Nang and were expecting us to visit. And of course were quite disappointed when we did not go because of the lack of permission.
The war was deadly for the Montagnards. They lost their lives by the tens of thousands. Most of their villages were destroyed. Their culture was shattered. But here and there in jungle clearings, groups of them still come together regularly and reverently for Christian services. The seed Gordon Smith planted in these remote places remains stubbornly alive and growing. East and West collided violently in Vietnam, with many casualties. But those who remember Gordon and Laura Smith remember that East and West did not always collide. Once they touched.